The morning sun had barely peeked over the courthouse steps when Judge Evelyn Richardson pulled into her usual parking spot. It was just like any other Tuesday. Her coffee still warm in its travel mug, her briefcase heavy with case files she'd reviewed the night before. She'd been serving on this bench for 15 years, and the familiar weight of her judicial robes felt like a second skin as she walked toward the entrance. The courthouse was quietly coming to life, the early morning hours bringing in the first wave of staff. The security guard at the front desk gave his usual friendly nod, and a few attorneys hurried past, their shoes clicking against the polished floor. Everything seemed normal until Judge Richardson reached the main security checkpoint. Officer Bennett stood there, a relatively new face in the courthouse security team. He'd been transferred from another district just 3 months ago. As other judges walked through with quick nods and minimal fuss, something different happened when Judge Richardson approached. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Officer Bennett said, his voice carrying an edge that made several heads turn. Judge Richardson noticed how he just waved through Judge Thompson and Judge Chen moments before without so much as a glance at their credentials. "Of course," she replied calmly, reaching for her judicial ID badge. She'd learned long ago that grace under pressure spoke volumes. As she handed over her credentials, she noticed how Officer Bennett held them up to the light, squinting at them as if examining a suspicious document. "These could be fake," he declared loudly, making nearby courthouse staff pause in their tracks. "We've had problems with people trying to sneak in lately." His tone dripped with skepticism, despite the clear photo ID and the fact that she was wearing her full judicial robes. A young clerk from the 3rd floor, who'd worked with Judge Richardson on numerous cases, stopped in her tracks. "Officer, that's Judge Richardson. She's been here longer than most of us," she said, her voice trembling slightly with disbelief at the situation. The officer's response was to wave the clerk away dismissively. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify these credentials." He emphasized the word verify, as if it were somehow amusing to him. By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching the scene unfold. The morning quiet had been replaced by uncomfortable whispers and shifting feet. A line was forming behind Judge Richardson, but nobody moved to complain. They were too focused on the unnecessary drama unfolding before them. Judge Richardson stood perfectly still, her posture straight and dignified. She'd faced moments like these before, though never quite so blatant, never quite so public. The weight of her law degree from Harvard, her 15 years on the bench, and countless decisions that had shaped local law, none of it seemed to matter in this moment. But something was different about this morning. Maybe it was the way the young clerk had spoken up, or maybe it was the collective intake of breath from the onlookers, but Judge Richardson felt a shift in the air. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been unfairly questioned, every professional who'd had their credentials doubted, every individual who'd faced that subtle but unmistakable bias. She reached into her briefcase, not for more identification, but for her phone. With steady hands, she opened her camera app, looked Officer Bennett directly in the eye, and prepared to document what would become a turning point in the courthouse's history. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't anger, it's action. The morning sun now streamed fully through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Nobody in the growing crowd knew it yet, but they were about to witness a masterclass in turning confrontation into education and prejudice into progress. The tension in the courthouse lobby grew thicker as Officer Bennett held Judge Richardson's ID badge like it was something he found on the street. More people had stopped to watch, creating an unexpected audience to this morning's display of disrespect. "You know what?" Officer Bennett said, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "I'm going to need to call this in." He reached for his radio, making a show of the whole thing. The crowd watched as he deliberately took his time, adjusting his radio volume, clearing his throat. A senior court clerk who'd worked there for decades couldn't stay quiet anymore. Officer, I can vouch for Judge Richardson. She's been presiding here for 15 years, she said, stepping forward with paperwork clutched to her chest. But Officer Bennett raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Ma'am, please step back. This is a security matter, he said, his tone dripping with authority that felt more like arrogance. He turned back to Judge Richardson, who hadn't moved an inch. Anyone could put on a robe and claim to be a judge. Judge Richardson's phone was still recording, catching every word, every dismissive gesture. She'd seen this kind of behavior before, not always directed at her, but at others who didn't fit someone's idea of what authority should look like. The difference was, this time it was happening in front of witnesses, in front of the very people who came to her courtroom seeking justice. Officer Bennett, she said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of her position. I notice you haven't asked for additional verification from any other judges this morning. I'd be interested in understanding your protocol for determining which judges require extra scrutiny. The question hung in the air like morning frost. Several onlookers exchanged knowing glances. A young attorney in the back of the crowd pulled out his own phone, quietly beginning to record the interaction. Officer Bennett's face flushed slightly, but he doubled down. We have procedures to follow, he insisted, though everyone present knew this wasn't standard procedure. For all I know, you could be trying to sneak into the building for unauthorized purposes. A court reporter who transcribed countless cases in Judge Richardson's courtroom stepped forward. I was just in her courtroom yesterday afternoon. She presided over the Thompson case. But Officer Bennett waved her away too, creating an even more uncomfortable atmosphere. The courthouse security supervisor, hearing the commotion, finally appeared. He took one look at the situation, and his eyes widened with recognition. Judge Richardson, I apologize for any inconvenience, he began, but she raised her hand gently. No need for apologies just yet, she said, her voice steady. I believe we're having an important moment here. Officer Bennett is demonstrating something that needs to be addressed. She turned to face the officer directly. And I think my courtroom would be the perfect place to continue this discussion. The crowd murmured. Nobody had expected this response. Instead of anger or demands for immediate disciplinary action, Judge Richardson was turning this into something else entirely. The way she stood there, phone still recording, dignity intact, spoke volumes about her character. I'll be presiding over several cases today, she continued, looking directly at Officer Bennett. I'd like you to observe the proceedings. Consider it an opportunity for both of us to learn something. Her words carried no hint of revenge or spite, just a clear invitation to understanding. The security supervisor quickly agreed, probably relieved that the situation wasn't escalating into something more confrontational. Officer Bennett's face had gone from flushed to pale, as the reality of his actions began to sink in. As Judge Richardson finally walked through the security checkpoint, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose, the gathered crowd began to disperse. But something had shifted in the air of that courthouse. This wasn't just about one judge and one officer anymore. It was about to become a lesson that would echo through these halls for years to come. The morning sun now filled the lobby completely, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air, as if even they were witnesses to this moment of transformation. The day's regular business would continue, but everyone present knew they had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than a simple security check. The morning's tension followed Judge Richardson like a shadow as she made her way to her chambers. The whispers and quick glances from courthouse staff told her that word of the incident was already spreading through the building like wildfire. She took a deep breath, placing her briefcase on her desk with practiced calm. Just then, a knock at her door broke the silence. It was her longtime court clerk, a woman who'd worked alongside her for over a decade. Judge Richardson, she said, her voice shaking slightly with anger. What happened downstairs? It's not right. Everyone's talking about it. Some of the other judges want to file a formal complaint. Judge Richardson smiled gently, motioning for her clerk to come in. "Sometimes," she said, settling into her chair, "the best response to disrespect isn't to fight fire with fire. We're going to handle this differently." Down at the security desk, Officer Bennett was feeling the weight of stares from his fellow officers. One of them, a veteran of 20 years, pulled him aside. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked in a harsh whisper. "That's Judge Richardson. She's one of the most respected judges in this courthouse." Officer Bennett's face tightened, but uncertainty had begun to crack his earlier confidence. The security supervisor had already informed him that he would be spending the day observing Judge Richardson's courtroom, not as punishment, but as she had requested, as an opportunity for learning. Back in her chambers, Judge Richardson reviewed her cases for the day: a property dispute, 2 domestic cases, and a civil rights matter. Perfect, she thought. These cases would show exactly why justice needed to be blind to prejudice. The courtroom began filling up as 9 a.m. approached. The usual buzz of attorneys discussing cases with clients, court reporters setting up their equipment, and bailiffs checking security filled the air. But today felt different. Word had spread, and the gallery was unusually full. Officer Bennett entered, directed to sit in the back row. He looked uncomfortable in his uniform, shifting in his seat as other courthouse staff shot glances his way. But Judge Richardson had been clear. This wasn't about punishment or humiliation. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Richardson entered. The room fell silent, every eye following her as she took her place at the bench. She moved with the same grace and authority she'd shown during the morning's confrontation. The first case began: a property dispute between neighbors, one claiming the other had deliberately damaged their fence during renovations. Judge Richardson listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and navigated through the tensions with remarkable skill. Officer Bennett watched as she handled each witness with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. He noticed how she made sure everyone felt heard, even when ruling against them. The morning's cases flowed smoothly, each one a masterclass in judicial temperament and fairness. During a brief recess, 2 attorneys who'd witnessed the morning's incident were overheard talking near the water fountain. "Did you see how she turned that whole thing around?" One whispered. "Instead of filing complaints or demanding his badge, she's teaching him what real authority looks like." The civil rights case was last on the docket, a discrimination suit against a local business. As Judge Richardson heard the arguments, her questions revealed a deep understanding of both the law and human nature. Officer Bennett sat straighter in his seat, his expression changing from defensive to thoughtful. By early afternoon, the gallery had thinned out, but the impact of the day's proceedings hung heavy in the air. Judge Richardson's handling of each case had spoken volumes, more than any angry confrontation could have achieved. Before the final recess, she looked directly at Officer Bennett for the first time since the morning. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom. No words were exchanged, but something shifted in that moment. The lesson wasn't just about respect or authority. It was about the power of responding to prejudice with dignity and wisdom. The sun had moved to the west windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. This day would be remembered not for the morning's confrontation, but for what came after. A lesson in justice served not through force or anger, but through example and understanding. As the afternoon session wrapped up, the courthouse halls buzzed with activity. Court staff who'd witnessed the morning's incident were still processing how Judge Richardson had handled the situation. Instead of the explosive confrontation many had expected, they'd watched a masterclass in quiet dignity. A young law student who'd been shadowing one of the attorneys caught up with her mentor in the hallway. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered excitedly. "The way Judge Richardson turned that horrible moment into a teaching opportunity. It's not what they teach us in law school." Meanwhile, Officer Bennett sat alone in the now empty courtroom, his notebook open but barely touched. He'd come in expecting to endure a day of humiliation. Instead, He'd watched as Judge Richardson handled complex cases with a mix of wisdom and humanity that made him question his own earlier behavior. The last case of the day had been particularly eye-opening. A dispute between a wealthy property developer and a small family-owned restaurant. Everyone expected the big money to win, but Judge Richardson had carefully weighed the evidence, asking probing questions that revealed the truth beneath the surface. "Court is adjourned," she had announced, ruling in favor of the family business. Her decision wasn't based on sympathy. She'd methodically outlined every legal principle that supported her ruling. Even the losing side's attorneys had nodded in reluctant agreement. Outside the courtroom, two veteran courthouse officers discussed the day's events near the water cooler. "Remember when that other judge got disrespected last year?" one asked. There were complaints filed, suspension hearings, the whole 9 yards. But this is something else entirely. His colleague nodded thoughtfully. "She's teaching without preaching, making him see what real authority looks like. Not the kind that comes from a uniform or a badge, but the kind that comes from wisdom and fairness." Back in her chambers, Judge Richardson reviewed the day's notes, adding final comments to each case file. A soft knock on her door made her look up. It was the courthouse security supervisor, looking both apologetic and impressed. "Judge Richardson," he began, "I wanted to talk about this morning's incident." But she raised her hand gently, just as she had earlier. "Before we discuss that," she said warmly, "tell me what you observed in my courtroom today." Her question wasn't confrontational. It was an invitation to reflect. The supervisor shifted his weight. "I saw justice being served," he admitted. "But more than that, I saw how you treated everyone with the same respect, regardless of who they were or what side they were on." A small smile crossed Judge Richardson's face. "That's exactly what I wanted Officer Bennett to see. Sometimes the best way to teach respect isn't to demand it, but to demonstrate why it's deserved." Outside her window, the late afternoon sun painted the courthouse steps in warm golden light. The day's regular crowd had thinned, but the impact of what had happened would linger long after the building emptied. The security supervisor cleared his throat. "Officer Bennett has requested to speak with you, if you're willing." There was a note of surprise in his voice, as if he hadn't expected this development. Judge Richardson nodded, gathering her thoughts. This was the moment she'd been working toward all day. Not a confrontation, but a conversation. Not a reprimand, but an opportunity for real change. "Send him in," she said, straightening the papers on her desk. "But first tell me, what changes do you think we need to make in our security protocols to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. It wasn't just about one incident or one officer anymore. It was about creating lasting change in a system that sometimes forgot the very principles of justice it was meant to uphold. As the supervisor left to fetch Officer Bennett, Judge Richardson glanced at the law degrees hanging on her wall, the photos of her swearing-in ceremony, the countless memories of barriers broken and challenges overcome. Today would be another milestone. Not because of the morning's confrontation, but because of how it would end. Officer Bennett stood outside Judge Richardson's chambers, his hand hesitating over the door handle. The confidence he'd shown that morning had melted away, replaced by something that looked a lot like understanding. He'd spent the entire day watching her work, seeing firsthand the respect she'd earned through years of dedication. Inside, Judge Richardson was reviewing the video from that morning's confrontation on her phone. She hadn't shared it, hadn't threatened to use it. She'd simply kept it as a record of what could become a turning point for the entire courthouse. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," she called out, her voice carrying the same steady authority it had held all day. Officer Bennett entered, looking markedly different from the man who'd challenged her credentials that morning. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, creating strips of warmth across the room. The wall behind her displayed not just her credentials, but photos of community events, thank you letters from grateful citizens, and artwork from local children. Judge Richardson, Officer Bennett began, his voice quieter than before. I've been watching your courtroom all day. He paused, struggling to find the right words. The way you handled that case with the elderly woman who could barely speak English. She nodded, remembering how she'd taken extra time to ensure the court interpreter got every detail right. How she'd made sure the woman understood her rights completely. Everyone who walks into that courtroom deserves to be heard, she said simply. That's what I wanted to talk about, Officer Bennett continued. This morning, I didn't. He trailed off, looking down at his hands. I didn't give you that same consideration. A group of lawyers passed by in the hallway, their voices muffled through the heavy door. Judge Richardson waited patiently, giving him space to gather his thoughts. This wasn't about forcing an apology. It was about fostering genuine understanding. You know, she said finally, when I first started as a judge, a cleaning lady stopped me in the hallway, asking to see my ID. She apologized profusely when she realized who I was, but I thanked her. She was doing her job. The difference was in how she asked, the respect she showed while carrying out her duties. Officer Bennett looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since entering her chambers. I didn't show that respect this morning, he admitted. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. Judge Richardson leaned forward slightly. Tell me what you learned today, watching my courtroom. Not about me, about justice itself. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He thought for a moment, remembering the day's proceedings. I learned that authority doesn't come from making people feel small, he said slowly. I watched you handle difficult cases, angry people, complicated situations, and you never once had to raise your voice or assert your power. People respected you because of how you treated them. A small smile crossed Judge Richardson's face. That's exactly right. True authority, Officer Bennett, comes from how we treat others, not from how we expect others to treat us. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick book, the Courthouse's Security Protocols Manual. I'd like your help with something, she said, surprising him. I think it's time we reviewed and updated these procedures. Not just about identifying judges, but about how we treat everyone who walks through those doors seeking justice. Officer Bennett straightened in his chair, understanding the significance of what she was offering. Not just forgiveness, but a chance to be part of the solution. I'm not interested in filing complaints or demanding apologies, she continued. I'm interested in making sure what happened this morning becomes a catalyst for positive change. Are you willing to help with that? The sun was setting outside her window now, casting long shadows across the courthouse grounds. In that moment, both judge and officer understood that this day would be remembered not for its confrontation, but for its transformation. The next morning arrived with a different energy in the courthouse. Word of Judge Richardson's handling of the situation had spread throughout the building, and the usual morning bustle carried an undertone of anticipation. People were curious to see what would happen next. Officer Bennett arrived early for his shift, the Security Protocols Manual tucked under his arm. He'd spent most of the night reading it, making notes in the margins about sections that needed updating. His fellow officers noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. Gone was the arrogant stance, replaced by something more thoughtful. I heard Judge Richardson asked you to help revise the security procedures, one of the senior officers mentioned while they were checking their equipment. That's unexpected. He paused, then added, but then again, everything about how she handled this has been unexpected. In her chambers, Judge Richardson was meeting with the courthouse administrator and the head of security. Coffee cups steamed on her desk as they discussed the previous day's events. I've never seen anything like it, the administrator admitted, shaking his head in admiration. Most people would have demanded immediate disciplinary action. Instead, you've turned this into an opportunity for institutional change. Judge Richardson smiled, pulling out a folder filled with notes she'd prepared. "Sometimes the hardest response is the most effective one," she said. "Now let's talk about how we can make this courthouse more welcoming for everyone who walks through those doors." They were interrupted by a knock. It was one of the courthouse regulars, an elderly volunteer who helped direct visitors to their correct courtrooms. "Judge Richardson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I had to tell you something." The judge gestured for her to continue. The volunteer stepped forward, clutching her visitor badge. "I've been volunteering here for 12 years," she began. "And I've seen all kinds of instances where people were treated poorly because they didn't look like they belonged. But what you did yesterday, it's already making a difference." She went on to explain how that morning she'd watched Officer Bennett help a young woman who was clearly nervous about going through security. Instead of being intimidating, he'd been patient, explaining the process clearly and respectfully. The courthouse administrator leaned back in his chair, a look of understanding crossing his face. "This is bigger than just one incident, isn't it?" he asked. Judge Richardson nodded. "It always was," she replied. "Yesterday wasn't about punishing someone for making a mistake. It was about showing a better way forward." Meanwhile, in the main lobby, Officer Bennett was putting his new understanding into practice. A group of high school students had arrived for a court tour, many from underprivileged backgrounds. In the past, he might have viewed them with suspicion. Today, he welcomed them with respect, explaining security procedures clearly and making them feel at ease. One of the students, noticing his name tag, spoke up. "Are you the officer from yesterday? The one who—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Instead of getting defensive, Officer Bennett nodded. "Yes, I am. And I learned something very important yesterday about respect and judgment. Would you like to know what it was?" The students gathered around, curious. Even their teacher seemed interested. Officer Bennett shared how Judge Richardson had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth, how she'd shown him what true authority looked like. Back in her chambers, Judge Richardson was reviewing the first draft of the proposed changes to security protocols. The new guidelines emphasized respect, clear communication, and consistent treatment for everyone entering the courthouse. "This is just the beginning," she told the administrator. "Real change takes time, but it starts with moments like these, when we choose to respond to disrespect with dignity, to prejudice with patience, to judgment with understanding." Outside her window, the morning sun had climbed higher, illuminating the courthouse steps where people from all walks of life were beginning to arrive. Each one of them would enter a building that was already starting to transform, thanks to one judge's decision to turn a moment of conflict into an opportunity for change. A week had passed since the incident, and the courthouse was buzzing with news of the changes taking place. The security desk, once seen as an intimidating checkpoint, had transformed into a welcoming first point of contact for visitors. That morning, Officer Bennett was leading a training session for his fellow officers. The conference room was packed, with even some senior staff members standing along the walls to listen. His hands weren't shaking anymore when he spoke about his experience. "Last week, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Instead, it became the most important lesson I ever learned about what it means to serve the public." In the back of the room, Judge Richardson quietly slipped in. She hadn't planned to attend, but her presence added weight to the moment. Several officers nodded respectfully in her direction, while others smiled, remembering how she'd handled the situation. Officer Bennett continued, pointing to the newly revised security manual. "We've always talked about security protocols, but we never really discussed how to make people feel secure. There's a difference," he explained, sharing examples from his own transformation. He told them about an incident from that morning, how a nervous young mother with 3 children had approached security. In the past, he might have seen them as a disruption to his routine. Instead, he'd helped the kids make a game out of going through the metal detector, turning a potentially stressful moment into something positive. "That's what Judge Richardson taught me," he said, his voice full of genuine respect. "Security isn't just about protecting the building. It's about protecting people's dignity too." During the break, a veteran officer approached Judge Richardson. "I've been here 20 years, she said, shaking her head in amazement. "We've had diversity training before, but nothing like this. This is real change happening right in front of us." Meanwhile, word of the courthouse's transformation had reached the local legal community. Attorneys were sharing stories about the noticeable difference in atmosphere. One public defender told his colleague about how Officer Bennett had helped his elderly client find the right courtroom, even taking time to explain the layout of the building. Back in the training session, Officer Bennett was sharing the new guidelines they developed. "Remember," he said, "every person who walks through those doors is someone's parent, child, or loved one. They deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of why they're here." Judge Richardson watched as heads nodded in agreement. She noticed how the other officers were engaging with the material, sharing their own experiences and suggestions. This wasn't just a mandatory training session. It was becoming a real conversation about change. During lunch, 2 courthouse clerks discussed the changes while waiting in line at the cafeteria. "You know what's different?" one asked. "It's not just about being polite now. There's this feeling that everyone actually cares about making people feel welcome." The other clerk nodded, adding, "Yesterday, I saw Officer Bennett helping a teenager who was totally lost. Before all this happened, he probably would have just pointed him to the directory and moved on. Instead, he walked with him, asked about his case, made sure he felt comfortable." Later that afternoon, Judge Richardson sat in her chambers, reviewing letters that had started arriving from community members. One stood out, a note from a grandmother who'd visited the courthouse earlier that week. "I was scared to come to court," the letter read, "but the officer at security treated me with such kindness. He reminded me of how your courtroom always feels, like a place where everyone matters, no matter who they are." As the day wound down, Officer Bennett caught up with Judge Richardson near the parking lot. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but that morning, it might have been the best thing that could have happened to me, to all of us." Judge Richardson smiled, watching as the setting sun painted the courthouse in warm colors. "Sometimes," she replied, "our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important discoveries." She paused, then added, "The real test isn't about falling down. It's about how we choose to get back up." 1 month after the incident, the courthouse hosted an open house for the community. The event wasn't just about showing people where to find different offices. It was a celebration of the changes that had transformed the building's culture. The main lobby bustled with activity as families, students, and community members wandered through. Officer Bennett stood at his usual post, but today he was doing more than just checking IDs. He was sharing stories with visitors, explaining how the courthouse had become more welcoming. "You see this security desk?" he told a group of high school students. "A month ago, it was just a checkpoint. Now it's where we start making people feel welcome." He demonstrated the new greeting procedures, showing how simple changes in approach could make a huge difference. Judge Richardson watched from nearby, talking with community leaders who had come to see the changes for themselves. A local pastor shared how his congregation members had noticed the difference. "They used to dread coming to court," he said. "Now they tell me they feel respected from the moment they walk in." A young law student approached Officer Bennett, notebook in hand. She was writing a paper about community policing and had heard about the courthouse's transformation. "What was the turning point?" she asked. "What made you want to change things?" Officer Bennett glanced at Judge Richardson across the lobby. "It wasn't about wanting to change things," he replied honestly. "It was about someone showing me a better way to do my job. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes." In one corner of the lobby, a display showed before and after photos of the security area. The before picture showed the old setup, stark and intimidating. The after revealed subtle but important changes. Clear signage in multiple languages, a small desk where people could organize their belongings, and friendly faces ready to help. An elderly man studying the display turned to his granddaughter. "I remember when coming here felt like entering a fortress," he said. "Now it feels more like visiting a library, professional but welcoming." Near the elevators, two attorneys chatted about recent cases. "You know what's different?" one asked. "It's not just about the security desk. The whole atmosphere has changed. Even the most difficult cases feel more human." The courthouse administrator joined Judge Richardson, carrying a stack of visitor feedback forms. "The responses are overwhelming," she said, flipping through the papers. "People keep mentioning how different it feels, how they're treated with dignity, even when they're nervous or confused." Officer Bennett had started giving informal tours to small groups, explaining the security process in a way that made it feel less threatening. "See these metal detectors?" he told a family with young children. "They're like the ones at the airport, but we try to make them less scary. Want to see how they work?" The children's eyes lit up as he demonstrated, turning what could have been an intimidating experience into an adventure. Their parents exchanged grateful looks. This wasn't the courthouse experience they had expected. Later that afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper interviewed Judge Richardson. "This story could have been about conflict," the reporter noted. "Instead, it's about transformation. How did you know this approach would work?" Judge Richardson smiled, watching Officer Bennett help an elderly couple find their way to the right courtroom. "I didn't know it would work," she admitted. "I just knew that real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding. Sometimes people just need to be shown a different path." As the open house wound down, visitors lingered in the lobby, chatting with staff and sharing their own courthouse experiences. The building felt different now, not just because of new procedures or training sessions, but because of a fundamental shift in how people viewed their role in the justice system. Officer Bennett found himself standing next to Judge Richardson as they watched the last visitors leave. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think my job was about keeping people out. Now I understand it's about helping people feel like they belong here." 6 months had passed since that fateful morning. The courthouse had become a model for other judicial buildings across the state, with representatives from different counties visiting to learn about their transformation. On this particular morning, Officer Bennett stood at his post, watching the sunrise paint the lobby in soft golden light. He thought back to that day, how one moment of prejudice had led to a complete transformation, not just of the building's security procedures, but of his own understanding of what true service meant. A group of new security officers gathered around him for their first day orientation. These training sessions had become his favorite part of the job. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's about how I learned the real meaning of respect and dignity in this very lobby." Up in her chambers, Judge Richardson was meeting with a committee of judges from across the state. They'd come to see firsthand how one courthouse had managed to change its entire culture. The numbers speak for themselves, the courthouse administrator reported, showing charts on a screen. Public satisfaction is up by 85%. Compliance with court orders has improved. Even staff morale has reached record highs. One visiting judge raised her hand. "But how did you handle the resistance to change? There must have been some pushback." Judge Richardson smiled, remembering the early days of the transformation. "The key was making everyone feel like part of the solution," she explained. "We weren't pointing fingers or assigning blame. We were building something better together." Meanwhile, in the lobby, Officer Bennett was demonstrating the new welcome procedures to his trainees. A nervous-looking young man approached the security desk, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Good morning," Officer Bennett greeted him warmly. "First time in the courthouse." The young man nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly at the friendly tone. "Don't worry, we're here to help. Let's figure out where you need to go." The other officers watched in amazement as he transformed what could have been a stressful moment into a reassuring interaction. That's what security really means, he told them afterward. Making people feel safe, not scared. Later that day, Judge Richardson received a letter from a national judicial organization. They wanted to feature the courthouse's transformation in their upcoming conference. Your response to that incident, the letter read, has become a blueprint for positive change in the justice system. During lunch, a group of courthouse employees sat in the cafeteria, reminiscing about how things used to be. Remember how tense it always felt in the lobby? One clerk asked. Now it feels like, well, like a place where justice is actually possible. As afternoon approached, Officer Bennett took a short break, walking through the now familiar halls. He passed the spot where he'd once stopped Judge Richardson, demanding unnecessary proof of her identity. The memory no longer filled him with shame. Instead, it reminded him of how far he'd come. Near the end of the day, Judge Richardson called Officer Bennett to her chambers. On her desk sat a framed photo from the open house, showing them both talking with community members. I received a call today, she told him. The state's Judicial Training Center wants us to develop a program. They want to know if you'd be willing to share your story with other officers. Officer Bennett looked at the photo, then at the judge who had shown him a better way. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he said quietly. Now I get to be part of the solution. As they walked together toward the lobby, they passed dozens of people. Attorneys rushing to file last-minute papers, families heading home after difficult hearings, court staff finishing their day's work. Each person they passed was treated with the same respect, the same dignity that had been missing that morning 6 months ago. The setting sun streamed through the courthouse windows, and Judge Richardson paused to watch the day's last visitors leave. You know what the real victory is? She asked Officer Bennett. It's not just that we changed one courthouse. It's that we showed it could be done anywhere, by anyone willing to choose understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over fear. As the doors closed for the evening, the lobby fell quiet. But the legacy of that transformative morning lived on. In every respectful greeting, every helping hand, and every person who walked through those doors feeling not like an outsider, but like someone who belonged in the halls of justice.